So, hello, and I almost said good morning, good evening. So, my name is Fredrik Karlsson, and I'm an economist. I am what you usually call a behavioral economist, and I'm particularly happy this week because actually the guy who got a Nobel Prize in economics was a behavioral economist, and maybe I'll mention his name today as well. So, I'm going to talk about the economics of antibiotic resistance, which obviously, as all the other topics in this course, is huge. So it's going to be, I'm going to do a lot of slides fairly quickly and sort of cover a lot of different topics. We'll see a little bit how time goes. Obviously, just interrupt me if you want to ask questions and things like that. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to define sort of antibiotic resistance as a social science problem. I'm going to call it a collective action problem. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the economic costs of antibiotic resistance. I'm going to talk about what are sort of the social factors for why the antibiotic resistance could be developed. And then I'll talk mostly about solutions or potential solutions. So, as a social scientist, I see antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance as something that we call a collective action problem. And before I sort of define that, I want us to be aware of the first and maybe most important thing is to be aware of that antibiotics are great. Antibiotics are really good for now I'm going to not see that instead. Antibiotics are great. They're good for society. They help people, etc. We can never sort of forget that, right? Second, and this is part of what you've learned in the course here, the more antibiotics we use, the more likely it is that we develop antibiotic resistance and the problems they cause. And third, antibiotic resistance is bad, and in particular for society as a whole. Okay, so that's sort of I know you know this. I'm still stating the obvious. However, given these three facts, it's likely from a social point of view that we use too much antibiotics. And the basic reason is that each individual that wants to use antibiotics has his or her own private benefit. The benefit of being treated, the benefit of being ill for a shorter period of time, etc. So from an individual point of view, it's beneficial to use antibiotics. But when we make those decisions, if we're going to take antibiotics or not, we're most likely in many circumstances not going to think about the rest of society. We're not going to think about antibiotic resistance. So that factor is not going to be something that we care about when we make that decision. However, even if we don't care about it, when we actually use antibiotics, it will have a negative impact on other people because it will increase the likelihood of antibiotic resistance. This is called the tragedy of the commons, and it comes sort of from the old description when you think you had a common pasture where you could graze your animals, and if it's a common and no one owns it, this common is going to be overused. And you can sort of see the same link here. Antibiotics are going to be overused because we only care about our own direct private benefit and not the cost for society. Another word that I'll use from time to time is going to be the word externality. So instead of saying this is sort of a tragedy of the commons problem, I'm going to call it's an externality problem. And it's an externality problem in the sense that of what I do when I take antibiotics, I have an external effect and an externality on other people. And so sometimes I'll use that word instead. Should also maybe say that, of course, sometimes taking antibiotics could be a positive externality because we're going to reduce the likelihood that other people get sick, of course. In order to solve this problem then, so if we have this negative externality, if we have this overuse of antibiotics, from a social point of view, we see that we need collective action. We need to act jointly in order to reduce the likelihood of antibiotic resistance, and we need to reduce the use of antibiotics. So this we're going to call collective action, that it's not enough that one single individual takes actions, it's necessary that a lot of people take actions. However, the main problem with collective action is that each single individual has incentives for hoping that other people will take action. So I can use my antibiotics, but all other people can reduce their use of antibiotics. And we'll call this free riding. That people are free riding on other people's sort of concern for this. And the role of social sciences here is to understand sort of what creates this problem, but also what are sort of the factors that can be behind an actual successful collective action. So that is sort of the role of social sciences here. Obviously, social scientists cannot invent new antibiotics or find a cure or anything, right? So it's our task here is sort of to increase the understanding of the problem and hopefully contribute to a reduction of the problem, at least. What we should also be aware of is that when it comes, so we have these tragedy of the commons problems, externality problems in a lot of different areas. However, antibiotic resistance shares a lot of features in common with, for example, emissions of carbon dioxide and global warming. This is a large-scale problem. A lot of people are affected. A lot of people need to take actions. Problems travel over borders, etc., etc. So usually we sort of like to call this sort of a large-scale collective action. So it's not going to be enough that one single country tries to reduce the problem of antibiotic resistance. So next time you're going to meet a political scientist, and here I know I've spoken with him, he's going to talk a little bit more about this sort of as a collective action problem. But what I'm going to do now is that I'm very briefly going to talk about the economic costs of antibiotic resistance. Okay? So the idea here is to sort of get a measure or a sense of, well, what are the costs of resistance? And in particular, get a measure of that in order to say something, well, what should we do? How important is it to solve the problem of antibiotic resistance? I'm going to use words like solve, etc. Right? I understand it's not going to be a problem that you can solve. So when economists think about this, sort of what are the costs of antibiotic resistance, the first thing economists think of are very sort of crude things, which is, well, if we get an increased antibiotic resistance, it's going to be more people that die. It's going to be more people that are going to get sick and will be sick for longer periods of time. Okay? In order to get a sense of what this is then worth, we need to translate this into an economic measure somehow, right? So what is it worth for society that people die? What is worth for society that people are sick? And sort of the most crude measure we have to translate what the economic costs are is simply to say, well, if people die, we lose productive capacity of people that could have worked and produced things. If people are sick, they cannot go to work, they cannot produce things. This can be cars, it can be movies, it can be books, it can be ice creams or anything, right? So what a problem like antibiotic resistance does is that it affects the economic activity in society. So when people try to sort of estimate the economic cost, that's the first initial thing that people look at. Okay? What is the loss in terms of economic growth of antibiotic resistance? And I'm not going to go through these sort of calculations in detail. So the reason why I wanted to show you these values that I'm going to show is that I wanted to get a feeling of sort of what is roughly the cost of antibiotic resistance. And it's going to be hard to interpret them anyhow. So the first study I'm just going to briefly present is a study called Estimating the Economic Cost of Antimicrobial Resistance. And what they do is that they look at different regions in the world. So OECD EU countries, Latin America, the MENA region, Eurasia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And then they look at different scenarios. So they have sort of different resistance rates, okay? So the base case is 5%, then sort of a normal case of 40%, and then doomsday, okay, 100% antibiotic resistance. And under these different scenarios, they sort of estimate, well, what's the fraction of the population that will actually die compared to another scenario? How much more will people be sick, etc. Okay? And then they translate these into economic costs in terms of loss of productive capacity. And I'm just going to show you one table. So this is loss in gross domestic product. So this is loss in economic activity compared to the baseline, which is if everything is as it is today. Okay? And the focus is not on the actual precise numbers here, but basically you can see that the cost would first of all depend on which region we look at, but also they would depend on the time horizon, and they would depend on sort of it's the worst case scenario or the sort of the normal scenario. Okay? And the costs, as you can see, they range from a decrease in economic activity of around 0.1% to up to, I think the highest is around 3.14%. Okay? So this is decrease in economic activity due to increase in antibiotic resistance. These values are very similar to the values we estimate for global warming. Okay? So I would say, if we sort of compare the importance of this based on this type of studies, I would say that antibiotic resistance is as important as global warming. Okay, so around these values is what we estimate for global warming as well. Another study, and I'll do this even quicker, is a pretty new World Bank study looking at economic costs. Here they add a few other things. Okay, they add loss in livestock production. They add decrease in international trade, and they add healthcare costs. Okay, so this is sort of expanding a little bit more than what we saw before. Here you see then, of course, the values will be bigger. We're up to between 1.2 and up to 5-6% loss of economic activity. So now you can say, well, is this high or low? Well, again, I think my best sort of way of explaining this, it is pretty high. And it is comparable to sort of other various serious things that can happen in terms of global warming, or as you have on the slide here, the financial crisis that we had a few years ago. So sort of from a social point of view, from an economic activity point of view, antibiotic resistance will for sure is for sure a potentially very serious problem. Okay, so what I've done, I've said this is a social problem. I've said, okay, this is how serious it is. It is indeed serious. I understand that most of you already knew that or sort of had a sense of it. Now you have numbers on it. What I want to now spend much more time on is to talk about, well, how can we, from a social science viewpoint, how can we solve this problem or reduce this problem? But in order to do that, it's important to understand, first of all, what are sort of the important factors for why it is a problem. Okay? So I'll go through a number of factors. Some of these you've probably seen already, some of these you haven't, some of these you will see later on in this course. So this is more to get a feeling of sort of in what areas can we actually, in what areas can economics and social sciences play a role here. Okay? So first of all, a few insights before I do that. So first of all, it's something that I call the One Health insight, which is that antibiotic resistance is a global problem. This means that sort of it can be spread between people, it can be spread between animals, it can be spread through foodstuff, and they can spread in our environment. Okay? So there are a number of different areas where we can have a problem with antibiotic resistance. This means that we cannot only think of one area and try to solve the problem there, because we will have other areas where we will have a problem as well. The second insight I think is important is that there is not going to be one single fix. Okay? It's not going to be one solution to antibiotic resistance. And the third, and this is always important to remember when you talk about antibiotic resistance, is antibiotics are good, okay? On the whole, antibiotics are good. We shouldn't forget that. So what factors are important for the development of antibiotic resistance? This is something I think you guys have heard a little bit about. So environmental factors. Too many people living on the same place together, too close. So overpopulation and crowding is going to be one important factor for development of antibiotic resistance. Globalization, transportation possibilities. So people travel much more now. We meet much more. That's going to affect the likelihood of antibiotic resistance. Poor sanitation, obviously. Okay, so simple people being too poor and having poor sanitation is going to be important. And use of antibiotics in agriculture. Okay? 4 important, what I call environmental factors. Okay? Patient factors. So adherence to dosage regimes, that they take the medication that their kid should have and they use it themselves, or as I heard during the break, they take the dogs' antibiotics. They have wrong information. They think that what they're doing is right, but it's actually not. People are poor, so they use antibiotics in the wrong way, and simply lack of education. Okay. Doctors' factors or prescriber factors. Doctors might prescribe antibiotics too much for a number of different reasons. For example, that there are economic incentives to treat a lot of patients and just solve the problem. They actually might not have the proper information and knowledge to make the right decisions. And there might sort of be norms on how to treat patients. And in particular, it might be an important interaction between patients and doctors that creates strange norms, or not strange, but creates certain incentives and norms. And of course, this could be seen as a substitute to infection control. So instead of caring about infection, now we're just going to use antibiotics. And then what I call drug factors. So availability of drugs, over-the-counter availability of antibiotics is of course going to, it's going to be important. And too little research into development of new antibiotics. Okay. So these are, as you notice, and I'm doing this on purpose, I'm just going through this very quickly because this is sort of not my area. My area comes now in 1 minute. Don't worry. So this is sort of now, what do we know now? It's a social problem, it costs a lot, it's a lot of different reasons why this is a problem, okay? Now, I want to talk about solutions. So this is what I'm here to talk about. So solutions, when I say solutions, I don't mean solutions, I mean ways to reduce the problem of antibiotic resistance, right? Okay, so that's what I mean. I don't think we will have one single solution to this. And basically, I usually say this, that there are the 3 most important solutions that I'm going to talk about here today. The first one is to get the incentives right, the second one is to get the incentives right, and the third one is to get the incentives right. Because in my opinion, that is what this is about, okay? And I'm going to try to explain what I mean, obviously, since I started with this. So, but from my viewpoint, as an economist, as a social scientist, it's all about incentives, okay? So what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, going back to not one single fix, as we have seen, there are a lot of different factors behind the problem, okay? So we're not going to have one single fix. That we don't have one single fix and we have a lot of different factors means that there are going to be a lot of different incentives in different settings that we need to get right. So that's what I mean by stating this 3 times, because there's going to be in many different areas where we need to get the incentives right in order to solve this problem. We need to get the incentives right in the environmental factors, for the doctor's factors, for the patient factors, etc. Okay. Second, and this is not on the slide, what I mean by incentives is trying to get people, and I don't then only mean patients, trying to get people in general to act in a better way. That could mean taking fewer antibiotics. That could mean doing more research in developing new drugs. That could mean not traveling as much or traveling more. That could mean educating yourself more, etc. Okay? Getting people to change their behavior in different areas. That is what I mean by getting the incentives right. If you sort of look at what do people suggest would be sort of the most important things to do. So there are a lot of different factors here. What would people say if you ask experts in these fields? What do you think would be the most important things to deal with? I would say these 5 at least would come on most people's lists. But I'm sure there are other people that would list a few other things. First, that a lot of people would say is, well, improve public health, improve sanitation, etc., so that fewer people get ill. That's gonna be a very important thing in order to reduce the use of antibiotics and therefore reduce the risk of antibiotic resistance. Stop using antibiotics in animal husbandry for growth purposes. Okay? Try to affect the incentives for prescription of antibiotics in healthcare. Affect the incentives for use and affect the incentives for development of new drugs. Okay. So 5 very broad areas that people would say these are the areas where we need to do a lot of things. Okay. Then there are more areas for sure, but I would say a lot of people would say these areas. I still haven't talked about solutions. I know it's going to come. Okay. Now it comes to the solutions. How can we now affect the incentives? How can we get the incentives right? Okay. And I would say there are, I'm not sure, maybe it's 4 or 5 solutions here that I'll list. The first one is that we simply tell people what to do and what not to do. And I'm going to call that mandates and bans. Okay? So you are not allowed to use a plastic bag. You cannot drive your car here, etc. You cannot use that type of medicine, etc. Second was economic incentives. Okay? Change the prices of different actions. Impose a tax on certain types of behavior. The most obvious thing here, well, tax environmental pollution, right, to get the prices right. Okay? Inform people, okay? Try to improve the information so that people can make better decisions. Help them to make better decisions, so decision support. And 5th, affect the decision environment. Okay? In what the environment where you make decisions affect that decision in different ways. So these will be the 5 different ways that I'll talk about how to change behavior. So the purpose of all these 5 is in a way to affect incentives for people to act. And what I'll try to do is that I'll take examples of these and talk about some of sort of the most important areas that I think needs to be fixed. Any questions so far? I know I talk fast and maybe not reading too much, so I'll read now and see if there are any questions. Everything is super clear. This is much easier than Morten, right? So I know that. Yes?
Explain the last one.
I will explain it. So this is actually the Nobel Prize, but I'll get back to that. It's a teaser. It's a teaser. Any other question? No? So let's look at vaccination first. So this is one way of reducing the problem of antibiotic resistance. Affect the incentives for vaccination. Okay? And I'll exemplify this with an example of economic incentives. Okay? So one obvious solution, I'm going to say solution, it doesn't matter. One obvious way to try to reduce this problem is to subsidize vaccines. Okay? So that people actually don't get sick, they don't need to take antibiotics. Okay? That's sort of an obvious sort of way of reducing the problem. So there is an economic reason or a social reason for why we could subsidize vaccination. because people will then simply not be sick and they won't need to be they won't be infected, and therefore other people will not be infected. But for antibiotic use, it's actually an extra incentive. Because it's not only that we vaccinate people, they don't get sick, they don't infect others, it's actually not also that they don't need to take antibiotics. So there's sort of a double reason for why we should subsidize vaccines. Okay? People don't get sick, so other people don't get sick. People don't get sick, they don't take antibiotics. We reduce the problem of development of antibiotic resistance. So this would be one way of getting the incentives right, getting cheaper vaccination out there. I'll get back to the question of, well, how much, right? I'll get back to that question a little bit later. Reduce the use of antibiotics in agriculture. Okay? That was one of the other big areas. I'll exemplify this with bans and economic incentives. So if you look at the ban, we could see sort of two broad policies that actually have been implemented in a number of countries. And one is simply ban the use of antibiotics for animal growth promotion, simply. You're not allowed to use antibiotics for growth promotion. Okay? And another one, slightly different but similar, is to ban all the use of antibiotics that is not under the supervision of a vet. Okay? So the vet needs to say, now it's okay to use antibiotics or not. Okay? So this is putting restrictions on what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So it's a ban or a mandate. Okay? And these types of bans have been implemented in a number of countries, including Denmark and Sweden. I think, do I have it here? Yeah, the Netherlands as well, for example. So this is the type of bans that have been implemented in a number of countries. This, for sure, have slowed the development of antibiotic resistance, and it has reduced the use of antibiotics. So there's sort of, I would say, no doubt about that. However, it does come with a cost. Okay? So we should be aware of that when we affect the incentives and reduce the use of antibiotics, it does come at a cost as well. And we could, of course, say that's okay. It's worth it, but we at least have to be aware of it. So, of course, what's going to happen if you ban use of antibiotics for animal growth reasons, well, a lot of them are going to say, well, my pig still needs antibiotics. He is sick. Okay? And you're going to increase the use of antibiotics for that reason. But also, what we've seen in these studies that have looked at it is, for example, that mortality rates go up. So more animals will actually die because we reduce the use of antibiotics. So there are a few sort of potential negative effects as well. Now, I wanted to contrast that with another idea, and that is that we actually implement a tax or a user fee for the use of antibiotics. Now I'm talking about animals, so for non-human use. So instead of saying you are only allowed to use the antibiotics under these circumstances, but not under these circumstances. Okay? Another idea would be to actually increase the actual cost or the price of the drug. And that would what we would call a user fee of antibiotics. So if you think about more sort of situation you're more common to, you could compare this to the use of gasoline in Sweden. What we don't do is that we ban certain types of use of gasoline. What we instead do is that we increase the price of gasoline. So it's going to be more costly to use the gasoline. It's going to be more costly to drive the car. Same thought can be applied to this one here. We increase the cost of using antibiotics, and therefore the use of antibiotics will go down. Why would this be better than a simple ban? Well, one advantage is that we don't need to control. We can just increase the price of antibiotics, and then it's up to the user of antibiotics to decide, is it worth it or not to use this on my animals? So it's going to be less control. We're also going to leave it to sort of the user of the antibiotics to decide, is this worth it or not? And this is why I I raise these negative effects here. Okay? So with the user fee, we might be able to reduce some of these costs. Because the user of the drug can decide, well, is it likely that the mortality rates are going to go up or not? Well, I'm going to trade off that compared to the increased cost of antibiotics. Why wouldn't we still want to use a user fee? Well, one important difference between a ban and a user fee is that with the user fee, we don't really have control over the level of the use. Okay? So we don't know, well, what should the user fee be? Should it be, how high should it be in order to reach a certain target? Okay? Which is a problem with any sort of tax that you might have. Affect the incentives for prescription. Okay? And here I'm going to exemplify it with something that I call the decision environment. Okay? Remember again, let me go back and remind you, I'm here, right? We have 5 different ways of affecting behavior. And now I've been jumping on economic incentives and mandates and bans. Now I jump to decision environment. Decision environment is actually, this is actually what the person that got the Nobel Prize in economics this week partly got the prize for. This is something that we call soft interventions or nudging. So this is about affecting the decision environment you are in. But it's not affecting it with economic incentives. It's not affecting it by having mandates and bans. It's just by changing the decision environment. And within that decision environment, there are no mandates or bans. You can still behave the way you want. Okay? So let me go back and explain the first slide first. What is this about? Okay. This is about affecting the decision environment. This is an experiment where people were interested in trying to get people to stop throwing cigarette butts on the ground. Okay? For those of you who live in Gothenburg, I think you have seen something similar actually here, where you have the pigeons at the tram stops, where it says the pigeons are trying to stop smoking. Don't throw the butts on the ground. This is very similar. So this is about getting people here to vote. Who is the best player in the world? Is it Ronaldo or Messi? So instead of throwing my cigarette butt on the ground, I'm going to vote for who is the best player the one that I want to vote for. This is an example of what I would call a nudge. Try to affect people to change their behavior with no mandate, ban, or economic incentives. Okay. Well, let's talk about antibiotics instead of cigarette butts. So this is slides from, or an example from a study on doctors in the US. And the way they were thinking here was, what if we tell doctors how they perform compared with other doctors? Okay? Let's introduce 2 elements. Let's introduce a competition, okay? But also let's introduce what you could call a norm, okay? The norm is you should only prescribe antibiotics when you should do it, okay? The competition is you should be better at this than other doctors, okay? So what they did in this study was that they looked at prescriptions by doctors. So this is sort of after they have done the prescriptions. And they went through them and they decided who made good decisions and who made bad decisions. Okay? I mean, that's quite often used. But the difference here is that then these doctors got an email and they were being told how they were behaving. Okay? And in this particular case here, you have, it's not too bad. You are not a top performer. Okay? You could have said you're bad. But I guess they didn't decide to use that word. They're just saying you are not the top performer. You are prescribing too many unnecessary. You are writing too many unnecessary prescriptions. Okay. Now these are real numbers. So some doctors actually got an email saying you are a top performer. Okay. You are good at this, and some got an even worse email saying you're. I don't remember exactly what the wordings are. Right. But some are being told they're good. Some are being told they're bad. Okay? And just by doing this, they've got a reduction in prescriptions by 16 percentage points, which is actually quite substantial, just by informing doctors about this. And mind you, these are doctors, right? We should think doctors always do the right things, right? Just by telling them this, we could actually reduce prescriptions by 16 percentage points. Quite a big effect. In the same study, they tried something else as well. And that is, well, when they're on their computers, they're going to write out the prescription. They actually had to justify the prescription. Why am I writing this prescription for this patient? So just by prompting doctors to justify what they're doing, what they found was that the level of prescriptions was reduced by 18 percentage points. Again, a huge effect. Again, these are doctors, they should know what they do. They should prescribe antibiotics when you need it, and they shouldn't when you don't need it, right? I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I have to be careful here, right? I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm saying we can fairly easily affect the level of prescription by these affecting the decision environments. It's actually possible that what happened here to some extent is that some people that should have gotten antibiotics didn't, right? So we need to be aware of that. We need to be careful about that. Finally, I think is the last incentives is to affect the incentives for drug development. Okay, this was the last point on things that we need to do in order to reduce the problem of antibiotic resistance. Okay, and I'm going to exemplify this with a mandate again. And this is sort of maybe the most obvious mandate that people think of when they think about this, and that's patent. Okay. And usually when people think about patents, they don't think very nice thoughts when it comes to medicine. All right? But I would actually claim that we need to be a little bit careful here. Okay? So with a patent, what a pharmaceutical company gets is basically a monopoly on their newly developed drug for a certain period of time, right? This is a mandate. We give you the monopoly rights to sell this type of drug, this type of substance for a certain period of time. Okay? The big reason for why we have patents, I would say, is that this creates incentives for drug development. Okay? If companies couldn't get the monopoly rights to sell their drug, their incentives to develop these new drugs are reduced. Okay? So if they don't have the patent to protect them, other companies can simply copy their newly developed drug and sell that at a lower price because they haven't had the investment cost, right? Okay? So that is sort of the fundamental economic reasons for why we think that patents are good. And of course, since the seller has a monopoly, what will happen is that the price of the drug will be quite high, or at least higher than it would have been without the patent. On the other hand, once we have a drug, we want people to use the drug, right? We develop drugs because people should use them so they are treated, right? So the drawback of a patent is that the prices get up and the use of the drug goes down, and that's usually bad. However, for antibiotics, that might not be bad. That's the twist here. Okay? It sounds a little bit strange, but actually it might be good with higher prices for antibiotics if we are using too much antibiotics, right? So that sort of counter-argument is less important for antibiotics than for other types of drugs. But of course, again, I need to be careful here. I'm not saying that it's always good with high price of antibiotics, right? But so the price might still be too high. But we sort of need to be aware of that the economic incentives of the price of a drug is actually going to affect the use. And for antibiotics, we might actually want to have a higher price. What about an antibiotic tax? I've been talking about global warming here and there, right? And usually what you hear in the debate is, well, why don't we have a global tax on carbon dioxide emissions, right? Can we sort of apply the same way of thinking when it comes to antibiotics. And I think that's quite, it's sort of, it's informative to think about it in that way, okay? Because antibiotic resistance and climate change share a lot of things in common. It's a global problem, so a lot of people in many different countries are going to be affected by this. Increased use of the resource is going to increase the risk of global warming or of antibiotic resistance. There is for sure scientific uncertainty in both these fields, and there is interesting technological development in both fields as well, right? So when it comes to global climate change, a lot of economists are arguing for, then why don't we impose a global carbon dioxide tax? So the way we could think here is, well, instead of thinking of global warming here, we can think of use of antibiotics as a negative externality. It's something that affects other people, and therefore we should reduce the use of antibiotics. And people don't take this into consideration when they make the decision, right? So it's very similar to thinking about taxing carbon dioxide emissions. So by imposing a tax on antibiotics, we would actually reduce the use of antibiotics, and therefore we would reduce the likelihood of antibiotic resistance. So I'm not proposing that, but I think this is an interesting way to think about this problem, which is very different from sort of what you would usually hear from sort of the science side, which is, well, we should develop new drugs. Okay? That's the important thing here. But there are many other areas sort of where we could think about this when it comes to actually affecting the use of antibiotics. Okay? Now, there are also a lot of problems with this solution. Okay? And the most obvious one is that the tax do not discriminate between different types of users, and in particular, high-income, low-income users. So a fairness issue would be pretty obvious here, right? But that's also present when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, right? But so it would be very similar. So now I've talked about a number of solutions. And I've ended on the solution side with sort of a grand solution that I don't think is really potentially going to be implemented. So as I've said, all these different solutions that I've gone through, I think are a number of solutions that would need to be implemented. But how should we then think of, well, what policy should we actually do? Okay? And how strong should this policy be? How should we design the patent system? How should we affect the decision environment? What mandates should we have, etc.? This is a whole field in itself that we call policy evaluation, which is about determining sort of what are the best policies. And I'm just going to end by talking a little bit about this. So the way we should think when we evaluate policies is to first of all determine, well, what is the goal of our policy? What is it that we actually want to achieve? And what are the benefits and the costs of different policy alternatives? And once we have set the goal, let's say we actually decide, well, we want to achieve this goal. We want to reduce the use of antibiotics in Sweden by 20%. Okay, let's say we specify that as our goal. That's our goal. That's what we want to achieve. Then as an economist, I would say, well, if you have a given goal, you should start thinking, well, what would be the most efficient way to achieve this goal? What are the least cost solutions that you could do in order to reduce antibiotic use? Is it a user fee? Is it changing the decision environment, etc.? So for a given goal, think what is the most cost-efficient way to achieve this goal. In order to determine the level of the goal, you have to think about the costs and benefits. Okay? To find how much should I reduce antibiotic use with? But then you need to think about the costs and benefits of different levels of the use. And of course, if you then add uncertainty, which you're going to have in most of these types of problems, it gets sort of even more complex, right? And it gets even worse. Okay? When we think about antibiotic resistance, it's actually not only us that we should care about. We should also potentially care about future generations. Okay? So the development of the problem today will actually affect future generations. So how should we think about future generations when we make a policy evaluation? Well, there are a bunch of problems here. First of all, how will they think, those who live in the future? How rich will they be? What type of technology will they have, etc.? Are things that we truly have a great difficulty in knowing, right? So comparing future generations with today's generation is inherently complex. What we tend to do is roughly this. We tend to think people in the future are basically like us. They're most likely a little bit richer. And therefore, we live today, we don't have as much money as those in the future, so we are more important than those that live in the future. So that's sort of a rough, quick version of how to think about that. However, even if we include future generations, still the same type of mindset. What are the benefits? What are the costs for today and for future generations when it comes to determining the policy, right? Oh, this was actually the last slide. I didn't have a finishing slide. Questions? I can leave this one. Right. So the question was, if we compare, I'm just repeating for everybody else, if we compare carbon dioxide tax with an antibiotic tax, sort of, seems to be sort of that we have a fairness issue that people in Africa, they don't use a lot of carbon dioxide, they don't use a lot of antibiotics, but actually they are the ones that actually would most need antibiotics. I would actually say it's exactly the same when it comes to carbon dioxide. They are actually the ones that needs much more energy than what they're having today. So it's actually exactly the same. So if we implement, say, a carbon tax, the whole problem would be centered around, well, how can we make sure that the most poor countries are not hurt by this tax, right? And this is a lot of what all the global warming policy discussion is about. The fairness issue of how do we still allow Africa, for example, to have an economic development. So it will be the same here. We would need to think about ways to transfer resources from the richer world to this African setting to compensate them for the higher tax. So subsidizing, in this particular case, subsidizing antibiotics in poorer countries would most likely be the efficient way to do it. So the problem is actually identical in many ways.
What would you do?
What?
You were in charge.
So I'm going to give the boring economist example. I would be a proponent of a global antibiotic tax. I would actually, as an economist, that's the most obvious way to think about this. We're using too much antibiotics, put in a tax on it to increase the price. And this, I should say, this affects incentives on all these areas, right? So sort of it affects the incentives for drug development, it affects the incentives for using the drugs, it affects the incentives to use the drugs in animal husbandry, etc. So if we talk about global warming, we have come a little bit. Okay? When it comes to antibiotics, not anything, nothing. So this is more of a paper product at this stage than anything else.
So on that depressing note,
it's good to go home now.
Time to go home.
thank you very much.
Thank you.